very fortunate today. We have, we're emphasizing T-34s, T-34A, and the T-34B. We have a lot of folks going to be here today. General Ingle's going to be here in just a few minutes, and he flew the T-34 in pilot training, and General Boyd here flew the T-34A in pilot training also, and they know how much superior it is to the B model, so we'll let them talk about that. Actually, there's not that much difference. I've owned two of them, and I can't tell the difference except one has nose wheel steering and the other one doesn't. And one you can move the pedals and the other one you can't. But anyway, after that, hopefully that we're going to have Bud Day here. And with that being said, we have books over here that General Ingle's going to sign, and if Bud Day is here, he will sign them. And also, if we have anything over there for you to sign, General Boyd, just go ahead right over and sign it. Now, while I'm talking about that, before we get started on the program, we have some DVDs there that are over here, and it's called Missions That Changed the War. You may have seen them on the military channel. There's one about Doolittle, Germany's Last Ace, and also the Flying Tigers. Now they're for sale over there. They're on sale today. I can't tell you what they're on sale for, but it's just today only. So they're over there in the Warbirds also. But for the first 20 minutes of this, we're going to have these T-34 experts, and Jeff probably is the T-34 experts as far as modifications and keeping them airworthy. And but Harold Cannon here is one of our Warbird directors. He also owns a T-34, and he's going to do that moderation. In the meantime, I'll talk to you in about 20 minutes. Oh, by the way, we'll have a question and answer system at the end of this, not between them.
Hi guys. My first Oshkosh was about 16 years ago. I stood out here, watched people land for an hour and a half. Can you hear me now, Smitty? Good. And watched my first T-34 take off and do a formation routine. And it cost me a lot of money since then. But it's been a great experience. General Boyd? I'd like for you to tell us a little bit. Now, this gentleman is a T-34 owner as well, but he did his primary flight training in the military in a T-34. Tell us about that.
Well, first of all, that was a long time ago. Most of you probably weren't even born then, but I went through pilot training in 1959, and this was, as Harold said, the first airplane. It was a civilian contract program in those days. Everybody started, the first 6 months of pilot training was done by civilians, and they were superb. They were older guys that had rich experience. Some of them had been instructing since the 30s, been teaching military pilots since the 30s and the 40s and World War II and up through the Korean War. Some of them were young fellows that had been in World War II and were aces or had 3 or 4 kills. We didn't know the treasure that we really had. These guys were terrific. And they didn't last much longer until after I left pilot training in the early 60s. The Air Force did away with that for the simple reason that even though they were rich, experienced pilots, they were not deployable, and we were getting ready to do a war where the whole pilot pool needed to be made available for that war. At any rate, my instructor, a gentleman had been a B-29 pilot in World War II, asked me in the beginning, he said, where do you come from and how'd you grow up? And I said, I'm a farm boy from Iowa. And he said, you drive tractors and you drive corn pickers and all that sort of thing? And I said, yep. And he said, you won't have any trouble. He said, this is a machine, just like the things you're used to. And indeed it was. And when we finished that 30-hour program, that old man said, son, he said, I believe that's the only reason God gave you a right hand was that it one day would hold a stick. And the only reason he gave you a left hand is that one day it'd hold a throttle. He said, you're born to this. It was a great airplane. I loved it. And I don't have any wild stories. I have one little story about that T-34. I'll tell you that. Right at the end, the last day that I flew it, we were supposed to fly only a specific amount of time, which would round out that 30 hours exactly. So I had an hour 20 or something I was supposed to fly. I went out and I got to doing aerobatics and some kind of low-level sightseeing, and we didn't buzz, and I lost track of time. And so the next thing you know, there's a call going out, with my call sign, wondering where the hell I was. And I got, oh my God, and I was way overdue, and I went back and landed, and I thought, I'm in deep trouble, they would throw me out or something. So my instructor grabbed me and he says, what are you doing? What are you doing out there? And I said, just practicing my maneuvers, sir. And he said, well, you're doing aerobatics? And I said, yes, sir. And he says, you're doing low-level flying? And I said, well, I wasn't breaking any rules. And he says, I like aerobatics too, son. You'll be all right.
I have a question for you. How many hours did you have before you soloed?
8, exactly.
And how many hours did your insurance company want you to fly before they gave you this one?
5. And my IP is sitting right over there.
Now, how did you were not a Air Force Academy grad.
No.
You came up a different way.
I was an aviation cadet. In those days, I didn't have a college degree, and if you could pass the quiz and so forth, you could get into pilot training, and that's what I did. They stopped that program, maybe because of me, I don't know. But after I left, shortly thereafter, they did away with that aviation cadet program, and the Air Force was mad at me, and they sent me back to school, and I had to get a baccalaureate degree and a master's degree later on.
And you did that where?
University of Kansas.
Now, what I happen to know, I'm a Baylor grad, and that's a Baptist school. He went there for 2 years before this. I haven't asked him what happened or how you left. And you may not want to say.
Well, I was an undistinguished student, and the only thing I really wanted to do is get into the Air Force and fly airplanes. And so after a couple of years of that, I just said, if I can get into that program, that's what I'm going to do, and that's what I did, and I never looked back.
Very good. Now, the General's aircraft is the one to my right, your left, and if you'll notice on the cowl it says Gray Eagle, and that's got a story too. Why don't you tell us?
The Gray Eagle is a distinction that is given to the longest serving active pilot in the United States Air Force at any given moment. So for the last year and a half or 2 years that I was on active duty, I was the oldest guy around, the longest serving pilot, and so I was the Gray Eagle. If you go in the Pentagon and up on the 4th floor outside the Chief of Staff's office, there's a great big glass case with a lovely big eagle there, and the brass plaques of every man that's ever held that distinction. And each of us are given a small maquette of that at the time that we hold the distinction.
Okay. You know, I think it's interesting that you... Round of applause for that? Absolutely. I think it's interesting that you started out in this airplane, and now it's your private airplane. Can you tell me how that happened?
Well, when I retired from the Air Force, I went to work in the civilian world immediately thereafter, and I maintained a pretty intense pace for the next 14 years. And at one point, a friend of mine, I didn't know anything about general aviation and had my mind on other things, but there's always, you can't be a pilot and love it as much as I did and never get rid of that gnawing in your gut, you know. And so one of my friends who really understood that, I think, said, have you ever been to Oshkosh? And I said, no. And he said, well, I'm going to take you. I'll come by and pick you up in my airplane. We'll go up there. And this was in 2009. So we came up here and spent a couple of days in this absolute kaleidoscope of color and sound and emotion and what have you. And it just absolutely captivated me. And so as we left, the airplane came back in to pick us up at Fond du Lac, and I saw a little airplane taxiing in. It's the cutest little airplane you ever saw. And so I went over and talked to the guy, and he says, what's the name of this? And blah, blah, blah. Is there a dealer anywhere around where I live? Told him where I lived, and there was. So I went up there, and so I'm just going to do this. You know, I don't have that many shopping days left till Christmas, and so I'm just going to get me one of these. Ordered it, took delivery of it. He checked me out, and I went out and I flew it home. And of course, as soon as I got away from the instructor, the first thing I want to do, I roll it, and I pulled the nose up, and the nose went down, and then, you know, in about 2 seconds later, we were up against the never exceed speed. So I says, this isn't going to do. I flew it a little bit longer, and I sold it, and then I started looking around. I needed something that was military. I needed something that was aerobatic, something that had some meaning to me. And as I looked around, it ended up that the T-34 seemed to be the right thing. Dan Blackwell, whom some of you know, had one. I found out he had one for sale up in Pennsylvania. I went up to look at it. Beautiful airplane, gorgeous thing. I dithered too long, and when I called him back to see if I could meet him on a price, he said I sold it yesterday. So I started the search again and found another one up here in Wisconsin, and I went up to see the guy and took a ride and in the back seat, and he said, you want to fly? And I said, of course. And so I took the airplane. I flew it for 5 minutes, and I said, that's enough, let's go back. And he says, you don't like it or what? I said, no, this is my airplane. It felt right. It's some of you know, it's a solid airplane. It's not a heavy airplane, it's a solid airplane, and it's honest, and it's military. The stick's where it belongs, and your right hand's on it, and the throttle's where it belongs. And so I was reminded that Thomas Wolfe in the 30s had a great novel, and he reminded us that you can't go home again. But he's wrong. He's wrong about that, at least in aviation. This airplane's home for me. It's where I started. It's undoubtedly the last airplane I'll ever own. It's a bookend. It's the other bookend on my life in aviation, and it's Chuck Boyd's airplane. That's all I got.
Thank you so much. Judd, would you Judd, real quick? Here, give that to him.
Here?
Yeah, just
give him the mic.
The T-34 in the civilian world has been around for some time. There have been several shops that have had a lot to do with restoring them, with maintaining them, with keeping them going. Charlie Nogle probably gets as much credit as anyone for making the T-34 into the warbird it is today. His son Judd carries on that tradition. Judd Nogle.
Hi there.
You grew up with this.
I've been around T-34 since I was probably 3 or 4 years old.
Yeah. And, you know, the 34 community's been through some hard times over the last 10 years. I think we're pretty much past all that. And tell us a little bit about what that was about and what happened and how we fixed it.
We spent the last 11 years now, since April of 1999, when an air combat school down in Atlanta, Georgia, was using the airplane for mock aerial combat and lost a wing in flight. Since then, we've had 2 more of those accidents, both with mock aerial combat missions. And we have literally been fighting with the FAA since
There you go.
1999 through about last December, getting the fixes approved to satisfy the FAA for any airworthiness concerns that they thought that we had. As a result, we have 2 airworthiness directives, one that was done in 2001 and one that was done in 2004 that require extensive modifications, inspections of both the main wings and the carry-through structure that goes between the wings.
And you know, at least as I understand it, these guys were diving each other and merging. And as they came to the merge, they're doing about 170 knots, which is in the yellow zone for this aircraft, and then pulling to the buffet. So what would happen is you'd cycle to well above 6.5 Gs, about 8 hertz, 8 times a second. So you overloaded the airplane 8 times a second for many minutes a day, and it finally failed a few years later. So in my opinion, it's a really strong airplane, and it's a stronger airplane now.
Yeah. And just doing it with the Buffett, there was just adding insult to injury. But
Right.
it wasn't like they took an airplane off the ramp and went out and pulled the wings off of it. All three airplanes had over 4,000 hours of air combat experience, simulated air combat experience, before they actually had any failures.
So, anything else you can tell us?
Any questions? Be happy to answer any questions anybody might have.
Let's do the questions after we get there.
Oh, okay.
If you don't mind waiting.
That's fine.
No.
Now, folks, we'd like to introduce General Joe Engle, Major General Joe Engle, let me put it that way. He's from Abilene, Kansas. Oh, well, I meant Texas. Abilene, Kansas. He went to the University of Kansas, and he was aviation cadet in 1955, pilot training in Malden. He flew the T-34A in Malden and the T-38, right? No, T-28. And then the F-100s at George. And then he was recommended by then Lieutenant Colonel Chuck Yeager to go to test pilot school. He graduated in 1962. He attended Aerospace Research Pilot School to train as an astronaut, graduated in 1963, back when I was 12. Selected as project pilot for the X-15, he did 16 flights, exceeded Mach 5 on 10. One of 8 X-15 pilots to become an astronaut at 32. He was the youngest astronaut. He's support for Apollo 10, backup for the lunar modular pilot Apollo 14, commander of the 747 Space Shuttle Enterprise, recently a re-entry glide test, 29 flights, 244 hours in space, only astronaut to have flown 2 different winged vehicles into space, X-15 and Space Shuttle Commander on the second Space Shuttle, STS-2, is that correct? And Mission Commander on STS-51-1. Now, you flew the T-34 in pilot training. What was your impression of the T-34? Just what my little, we really didn't get that much time in the T-34, did you?
No, we only got, I only got about 30, 40 hours. I can't remember. It was somewhere between 30 and 40 hours in primary, and then they transitioned us into the T-28. But I really, boy, I've just listened to General Boyd talk about it. That's exactly what I would have said if I could talk that pretty. Is that, you know, all the emotional feelings that you get to that airplane. One thing you missed. I had really desperately tried to, not necessarily build up flying time, but to get as much flying experience and learn as much as I could about flying. So when I did get in the Air Force, and I knew I was going to get into a class that I could do reasonably well. I could fly and I'd feel comfortable with an airplane. And so there were 2 things about the T-34. First of all, I got to admit, it was a neat airplane to fly, and it was free. I didn't have to pay for the flying time anymore. And how many of you have been in that situation? Yeah, it's not a great feeling when you get to fly a neat airplane. And to me, after flying Cessna 140s and Luscombs and anything that the little grass airport had that I could fly, to get a tricycle gear airplane with a canopy and nobody sitting beside you, you could really be a fighter pilot in this thing, and it would fly like a fighter. That little rascal would do anything you wanted it to do, and it's just a beautiful flying airplane. I just enjoyed the heck out of it.
Well, now, Joe, you've had some experience in the B model. Tell us about your experience in the B model at Maxwell.
Well, I know I'd rather tell it first, because the first guy really has the advantage. The second guy has to prove him wrong. I was flying, was a bunch of young Eagles we were flying down
Young
there.
Eagles.
And Chuck Yeager and I were flying them in a couple of Sam and Dogs, I guess, airplane. And I came back, and I know full well that tire was balded before I ever started flying that afternoon. But I got credit for putting a bald spot on the tire of Sam's airplane. Was it your airplane?
No, it was Dog.
It was Dog's airplane. Well, I got credit for the bald spot on the tire, and I not only got credit for the tire, I got the tire mounted on a big plaque that I had to promise to display in a prominent place in my home. And I do.
Well, it was a lot of fun, and I think it really was flat before you got in it, but you just didn't notice it. You didn't do a walk around as you're supposed to do.
I did, but I noticed that flat spot was right on the bottom of the concrete.
Oh, okay, that makes sense. But actually, Joe didn't fly the T-34 that much, but he did fly some other things that I think people would be interested in, Space Shuttle X-15. So, Joe, tell us about a typical mission in the X-15.
The mission itself lasted anywhere from 10 to 12 minutes, depending on whether it was a speed flight. Normally it'd be about 10 and a half minutes long because you burn the propellant out full throttle, and the propellant was gone in a minute and a half. The engine would burn for about 88 seconds, and then you're out of fuel. The rest of it was just coasting and deceleration and getting data. And you would decelerate because you were only at about 110,000 feet, so there was a good bit of drag. The altitude flights lasted at least 12 minutes long because you were arcing over the top, literally in space, above the atmosphere, and it would just take that long to arc up over the top, make the re-entry, and then set up and land. So both missions lasted in the neighborhood of 10, 12 minutes. About a minute and a half apart. It's really hard to build up flying time in that X-15 at 10 minutes of flight. But it was a very exciting airplane to fly. It was an honest airplane, and you felt comfortable in it, except in a few instances when you got close to the edge of the envelope, and either during the re-entry or very high speeds.
Well, now, later in your career, particularly in the Space Shuttle, you had simulators that actually were pretty much identical. What kind of training did you have for the X-15? Because that was pretty early in the program.
Yes, it was. We really didn't have a good trainer for the high speed and the really high altitude flights, although we could get a feel for what losing control with aerodynamic surfaces and regaining control with aerodynamic surfaces was like with the F-104. The F-104 was an excellent trainer for the landing pattern, setting up the overhead, getting the sight picture to line up on final approach, and touching down precisely where you wanted to. And we used the F-104 very extensively, more than we really would have had to, because it was a fun airplane to fly too. And using the excuse that we were going to go practice approaches, and we did. We'd take the 104 and go uprange in the desert and find abandoned lake beds where we could use them as emergency landing sites and practice landings into these remote runways. The lift-to-drag ratio, we could configure the F-104 with coming to idle, speed brakes out, flaps down to landing, and the gear down, and that was about the same lift-to-drag that the X-15 had when it was coming in. So we had a really reasonably good airplane to practice with, set up the pattern.
Well, I guess the next step in your career was the Apollo. Is that correct?
Right.
All right.
Right.
Well, now you were involved in the recovery of Apollo 13. You remember we were discussing that this morning, so you don't remember.
I have trouble remembering.
No, seriously, that was very interesting what you had to say about the Apollo 13 and how the computers got them in, and particularly your role in it of cutting up toilet paper.
It was. I wasn't really recognized as that much of a computer expert at NASA. So I really wasn't asked for the tough questions or the tough answers on computers and what to do with them. But one of the things that happened on Apollo 13, you probably remember, the command module had an explosion and lost all its oxygen, which was used to generate both electrical power and pressurization and for breathing. And so fortunately, they had not committed and separated from the LEM in lunar orbit yet. They hadn't made it to lunar orbit yet. So the LEM was still out there and intact. And the decision was made to use the LEM as a lifeboat to go live in and to use its computer and its guidance and command system to make the burns, to keep the two vehicles on orbit or on track to hit at the right place near the moon and above the moon to swing around the moon and then make a burn on the backside to head back to Earth using the lunar module's descent engine, the one that would normally be used to land on the moon, because the engine on the command module was not available. So they used the lunar module for a lifeboat to perform all these functions. The guys went, transferred in there because they didn't have any oxygen to breathe, no way to get rid of carbon dioxide in the command module. And after about a day period of time, they would have been suffocated in there. The lunar module had the systems operating all right, but they didn't have enough lithium hydroxide canisters. Those are the things that filter out the carbon dioxide so that you can reuse that air again. They had some, but not enough to get 3 people for the 5 days it was going to take to get them back. It was only a 2-man vehicle, remember. The other guy stayed in the command module. So there was plenty of lithium hydroxide containers to wash out the air in the command module, and not near enough in the LEM. The only problem was the command module canisters were round, and the ones in the lunar module were square. Why they didn't make them the same, I don't know, because I guess everything was very space critical, and where they ended up with space for lithium hydroxide storage was square in the LEM. But anyway, one was round, one was square. So they had plenty of filters, but they just didn't fit the right filtration, the air ventilation system in the LEM. So Deke asked me and a couple other guys to go over to the simulator, lock ourselves in the simulator with nothing but what the crew had, the checklists and the duct tape and stuff like that, and figure out how to make the round containers work in the square hole. I think he did that because it was not probably 6 months before that. He and I had been on an elk hunting trip up in Wyoming, and we had a stove in the tent, and it had a square top on the stove, and of course the pipe that went out the top of the tent was round, and we had to adapt something to hook one to the other. So I think that was the only reason he let me even put my hands on anything on a mission that critical. But he told me, okay, go ahead and figure out how to make that work. You got to use the stuff that's in there. So we cut up the heavy cardboard checklist, adapted them from a square hole to a round thing using duct tape, and brought it back and showed him in mission control. He said, okay, tell them to build it this way. And so that's how they washed out the carbon dioxide.
Well, explain to us again how the computers, not you, but the computers figured out exactly where the entry was so that it wouldn't burn up. I guess there's a very small angle there, I guess, where it will disintegrate.
It was a small window that the Apollo had to come in sort of almost tangent to the Earth, to the atmosphere, so that it would hit with enough deep enough or fast enough into the atmosphere to get enough drags to slow down and continue to fall in the atmosphere. And the two opposite sides of that, one is if it came in too high, it would just skip right off and go back out into deep space, and then they wouldn't have had enough consumables to last. If it had come in too steep into the Earth, it would, of course, dug into the atmosphere too fast and burned up or broken up. So it was a very, very small window. I've heard people say that if you take the Earth and make it the size of a softball and put the moon 10 feet away, it'll be the size of a ping pong ball. And being 10 feet apart, then the moon, of course, is going around the Earth. In 3 days it takes to get to the moon. On that scale, the moon would have traveled 10 feet. So you can figure you got to aim 10 feet ahead of a ping pong ball, and you got to come right along the edge of it within the thickness of about 3 to 4 sheets of typing paper. And that's how accurate the guidance has to be. Now, they didn't do that in one burn from the Earth. On the way to the moon, there was burn corrections that they could make, called mid-course correction. Kind of like tossing a bowling ball down and then patting it as you're going down there to make sure it goes right in the center of the lane all the way. But it was, in fact, a very critical computation and awesome computation, too. I really hand it to the engineering community, the guidance folks that figured it out.
Well, unfortunately, Joe was prepared to go up on Apollo 17?
17, yeah. Are you? Did you hear him? Huh? Can you hear him okay? Okay.
Let me borrow one of these others. Oh, I'll use it.
Can you? So, I don't know. Maybe it's some speaker. I can't hardly hear him, but I can't hardly hear him anyway. I ignore him most of the time.
Well, you were on Apollo 17. Unfortunately, you got bumped. There was was he a geologist?
Yeah, geologist. Jack Schmidt had a doctorate in field geology.
But he was in the initial space shuttle program. And tell us about when you were doing the glide tests off the 747.
The Space Shuttle Enterprise, which was different from the ones that went into space. It was lighter in weight. It was about 50,000 pounds lighter because it didn't have all of the rocket engines. It didn't have all of the orbital systems that you need to take into orbit. All we wanted to do with it was to determine if aerodynamically that shape would fly okay, that it was controllable, and that you could land it in an unpowered glide situation. And by putting it on top of a 747, taking it up to 20,000 feet, and then flying it off the top, we could pick the day where it was an ideal day. There was no wind, no crosswind or anything, and pick the conditions, and the pilot could pick his conditions too. If you could go out and practice that morning and be all tuned up and ready to go fly the test mission. Whereas if you committed to a space flight, you don't have that luxury. So that decision was made in order to get the initial aerodynamic data for the vehicle, determine how much margin there was in the control system, how much margin there was in the stability system on the airplane. And we flew 5 flights off the top of the 747.
Well, how about the first one? Did you and Fitz knew what was going to happen when you separated up there?
Well, pretty much, yeah. Yeah, pretty much. They not only, most of the wind tunnel showed that the space shuttle would fly off and not slice off the tail of the 747. There was still some doubt in the engineering community that was going to work, but wind tunnel showed it probably would. There was a guy at NASA that made very large-scale radio control. He was really a good radio controller, model maker, and he made a model of the 747 and the shuttle and flew it out at Ellington and showed that would work too. The maneuver, Fitz would push over to pick up 240 knots. That's what we needed in order to have enough speed, enough lift to fly off and fly clean of the 747. And then when he got on speed, he would call on speed. He would dump the spoilers, come to idle, and push over a little. We would pull back and pull 1.5 Gs to get off the airplane. And we'd turn right, he'd turn left.
Now, you mentioned the fact that you didn't have much simulator as far as the X-15, but you did have, what, a G2 or a G5 or something like that was set up in that, and the spoilers and all that would come out?
For the space shuttle, we had a G2, which was a very highly modified airplane that would simulate the response of the cockpit to every input you made. We had a little control stick, just like the space shuttle control stick, and when you made an input on that stick, the cockpit would move, lurch up and down, left and right, just like the space shuttle would. Not at all like like a normal Gulfstream cockpit did, but it had full span flaps that would go up and down, dump lift, create more lift, and large ventral fins underneath that would give you yaw maneuver or yaw feeling acceleration, just like the cockpit would. It was a really very, very good simulator for the. So
in other words, you felt like when you actually got in the space shuttle on your mission, that it actually flew pretty much like this.
Very, very close to the G2, and they would retune the G2 after every flight. But yes, it was very close up front.
Now, when they do the landings of the space shuttle and they have it on news, they're always saying it's on automatic pilot. Was it on automatic pilot when you flew it?
No, when it lands, it actually, the pilot is landing on every landing. The pilot takes over, the commander takes over at high key when you come overhead, about the time you come subsonic, a little before you come subsonic. And the reason for that is so that he can start feeling the airplane out. He can start communicating with the shuttle. You know, the stick isn't hooked to the surfaces or anything. It goes to a computer, and the computer looks at the stick, and then it decides what the surfaces ought to do. So during entry, the stick does not move if the autopilot is flying it. So you take over at high key to give you a little bit of time to get familiar with the airplane, and you make the inputs. It's still going through the computer, but you make the inputs, commanding pitch and roll and yaw maneuver.
Well, it'd be kind of hard to train all that time and then let that thing make the landing after you've been training all this time. Not many people would put it on the autopilot.
Well, that's very true. But, and, you know, an additional argument to that is that if something did go wrong with guidance, if it did start to divert, you would have to wait a while to make sure the auto land is screwing up before you took over, or you'd really get chewed out. So you got to let it deviate a little bit. Then you're taking over from an off nominal condition. So we used that argument and won that one.
Well, Joe, you've had quite a space career and also a career in aviation. Tell us your thoughts now on the cancellation of the project of the space shuttle.
Oh man, I hate to see it go. I think everybody hates to see us quit flying the space shuttle. I think that one of the reasons it hurts is that we don't really have another vehicle ready. It's going to be at least 5 years before the United States has another vehicle ready to go. And it's just, I was telling Jeannie, it's almost like losing your old dog and not having a new puppy right there ready to start training right away. If we had a new vehicle that we had to go through a testing with, that'd be great. But we don't have it. It's going to be a number of years. I don't think anybody likes it. I don't think anybody can claim that it's a complete surprise, because we have known we were going to have a 5-year gap before we had another vehicle ready to take people into space. But we couldn't make it important enough to Congress to appropriate the money to develop a new system. So we're stuck with what we have. I think, having said that, and having listened to people say, well, now we got to rely on those damn Russians, and that's really terrible, and they're really rubbing our nose in it. I look at it from a little different perspective. We've developed, over the last 15 years, a very close working relationship with the Russian Space Agency and their engineers and technicians, and we work very, very closely with them. And I think we're darn lucky to have that relationship and that communication with them, so that we can use Soyuz vehicles until we get our next vehicle ready to go.
Well, if they put the funds back in tomorrow, how long would it take them to spin back up?
Well, I don't think you could spin the shuttle back up. With enough money, enough years, you probably could start over again. But I'm not sure that'd be the right thing to do. I think the unique requirements that we had when the shuttle was built, we needed a payload that big. We needed enough capability, much capability to take into and return from orbit. The DoD had some requirements that sized the space shuttle. I don't think we'd rebuild another shuttle per se, but I do wish we'd build another winged vehicle that you could come back and land with a stick and rudder on a runway.
Okie doke. Bud Day is still not here, but in the meantime, we're going to open it up for questions. Does anybody have any questions for any of these people here?
My question is for General Boyd. Can you describe how the technology in this airplane, your cockpit and your engine, compares to that airplane that you learned to fly in 1959?
Well, I've got a lot different engine. I've got a Continental IO 520, 285 horse engine with a 3-bladed prop. And frankly, the distance between flying that original, which had a 225, and this airplane, my memory's dimmed a little bit there. But it does climb certainly much better than that original. And it has kind of if my memory's right, it has a better sound to it. Sound matters, and it just got a growl to it that I don't remember that 225 having. How about you, Joe? Do you think that's right?
I don't ever remember that one that I flew growling. It had the two-bladed prop and the little engine in it, but I was just happy to get airborne with it. I wasn't worried about growling. I was sitting there listening to those T-28s growl, and that was scary.
General Engel. General Engel.
Yes, I'm sorry.
Those few times where you're out there in the 104 and you, just to break up the monotony of shooting the approaches, did you ever have a chance to do some air-to-air dogfighting with a different kind of airplane?
Yeah, you betcha.
How'd you do against the different kind of airplane in the 104?
Not very good.
What were the other airplanes?
Well, at Edwards, we had, at the time I was there, we had the whole stable of Century Series airplanes. So we had F-100, 101, 102, 104s, 105s, 106. And then, of course, the Navy down in Miramar, they had the F-8s, and they were really bad boys down there. They were good with those F-8s. The 104 was a fun airplane to fly because it would just go like a scalded dog, and you could go Mach 2 with it, and you could go to 80, 90,000 feet in a zoom and zoom over the top. But you couldn't turn in a fight. Once you started your turn, you had to be careful. If you got too much angle of attack in, you'd get that the vortices would come over the tail and pitch up, and then you'd go out of control. So, I'm sorry?
Mach 1 straight up?
Oh yeah, well, not straight up, no. You could accelerate out to Mach 2 at 35,000 feet or so, and then 2.2 was really the limit, the temperature limit on the front stage compressor, and you'd pull up, and then you had to actually start throttling back as you climbed because you would exceed the temperature as you started going up about a 40-degree angle or so, and then shut the engine down. If you really were trying to get to 100,000 feet or so, you'd shut the engine down about 80,000, or it would overtemp. It just flat overtemp, and then coast over the top, and then re-enter and start the engine back up.
Okay, well,
Yes, sir.
How old were you from you went on the full space shuttle ride?
How old was I? How many? 49? 49 years old? My wife is telling me 49. I can't remember that far back, but yeah. 49. I was pretty old by the time I got to fly the space shuttle. And I really felt lucky because I was almost too young to get to fly the X-15. I was probably the youngest guy to get to fly it. And then I kind of there's that hiatus before the shuttle was ready to go, and I was afraid I was going to be too old before I got to fly the shuttle. So I kind of just caught the tail end of the X-15 and the nose end of the shuttle. Oh, is that right? Probably looked a lot younger than I do now, right? Mm-hmm. To have more hair?
This is for General Boyd. General Boyd, I was in Air Force ROTC at the University of Florida, 55 to 57, and we did a base visitation at Air Force Training Base, and they had Super Cubs and T6s. Was that before your time? No.
Yes, indeed. I think Sam maybe can answer that question better than I can. When they stopped the T6 and the Cub?
Well, at our base at Marana, Arizona, we were the last class that had Super Cubs and T6s, and that was in 1954. And my friend Ed Bolin here, he flew T6s the next year. What, at Malden? Was it Malden? 54? Yeah, where were you, at Malden? At Malden, Missouri. So they varied. They didn't just cut them all out at once. It depended on, each base had a phase out, but it was all done there right in 54.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
I think the Air Force had a very narrow window in which we used the airplane. The Navy used it much, much longer. I think the window was somewhere in the neighborhood of 54 to 61, and then they were gone. Yeah. Maybe even 60.
I had that number written down, but I forgot what I did with it. Anybody else? You sure? Okay.
Okay, try and get there. Okay. This is a question for Joe Engel from England. You, as I understand it, flew with Dick Truly. And if my memory serves me correctly, he's a naval aviator?
He is, certainly is. Very good naval aviator.
Was there any conflict in the shuttle, and did you allow him to fly it too?
Oh, there was no conflict in the cockpit at all. I mean, in order to get to fly the airplane, I had to learn 200 years of Navy history and tradition, and answer any question that he came up with. It was a very fair agreement, I thought. Dick was a great pilot. He was a great crew member. In fact, we started out being assigned to the approach and landing tests that flew off the 747. We remained a crew throughout those tests. And at that time, they named us as the backup crew for STS-1 and the prime crew for STS-2. So we were a two-person crew training very, very intently together for over 6 years. And I must say, we enjoyed every minute of it. Dick had a great sense, still does have a great sense of humor. Ben, you're right, he's Navy. You got to watch him like a hawk.
With the help of Bill Douglas, who was slow fact that had been shot down and wounded and went to hospital and got in the 100 program, came back and to Phuket in 37th Wing. And I might tell you that Bill Douglas did all the heavy lifting because he was a hell of a worker. And so we had to figure out how to use the Hun versus the slow flying Cessna.
Yeah. Well, I understand that you having escaped and then being recaptured had a great deal to do with your mistreatment as a POW. They kept throwing that up where you were escapee. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's true. It's hard to imagine that anyone would dislike you for escaping from a communist country. But being that they were a bunch of misled communists, they hated all of the escapers. There were 3 or 4 of us, and all of us wound up on the short end of the stick in terms of treatment while we were there.
Well, at one time, John McCain was in your, whatever you want to call it, cell, I suppose.
Yeah, I got shot down August 26, 1967. John got shot down October 26, 1967. And both of us were busted up pretty bad. During the escape, I got wounded in the right leg. I got shot in the left thigh when they recaptured me, and because I took off running and wouldn't surrender. And so when I got John, he was busted up in almost every extremity. And I never really thought he was going to make it. He was right on the verge of death all the time we lived together. And but luckily, he had strong will to live, and he just willed himself to stay alive.
Well, thinking of that, I don't know whether you would care to talk about it or not, but the collaborators that were over there, which I suppose were very small, how did you deal with those guys over there, and then after you got back?
Well, we had a problem because Vietnamese segregated these guys. And we had a very, very small number of people who wouldn't keep the faith. They were led by a Marine Corps lieutenant colonel named Miller. And he was assisted by a Navy captain who I think hit his head or something. I don't think this guy was really that bad a guy. And there were about 3 or 4 other people that were sort of hangers-on with these 2 guys who were basically taking better treatment from the Vietnamese in exchange for writing a lot of letters and speaking against the country and so on. So the beauty of that was that there were a very small number of them, and the things that they did were not really all that consequential. It was never like times back in China when they claimed we were doing the germ warfare and so forth. It never had the same impact. And so the unfortunate part of that was we were unable to do anything about them when we got back. We charged them with treason, everything you could think of, and the political people were scared to death of messing with them, and the Army general that was in charge of part of some of these people said that they didn't want to charge these guys because we would be parading up and down to the courthouse and inflaming the anti-war people some more. Our personal opinion was we can give a damn whether we inflamed the public or not, because the public who was working against the war were a bunch of losers at that time who were anti-war and anti-country and anti-military, and we didn't give a damn about what they had to say. But the bottom line was that the civilian leadership of the Navy and the Army refused to do anything significant. They kicked them out, gave them a letter of reprimand and one thing and another, and they went their way. And basically, if we'd had our way, they'd have been in jail for a long time.
Did they stay in the military?
No. The secretaries dismissed both of them, these two senior guys, and as I said, gave them a letter of reprimand, put them out, but basically that was really no punishment at all for that kind of conduct.
Now, folks, if you really want to know how much horror he put up with, you need to buy the book. We're not going to get into that. However, when did your conditions actually improve, and did the wives have anything to do with that?
Yes. Our conditions improved a lot when Ho Chi Minh died, which was in September of 1970. He was a miserable, brutal, murderous old commie who had killed literally thousands, hundreds of thousands of people. And so he died. And it was kind of like when Joe Stalin died. The worst guy in the country just died. But these people have been so brainwashed and propagandized just nonstop about he was the savior. And you would have really thought that Jesus Christ died that day, because there was mourning and so on, and went on for literally days. But almost instantly, our treatment changed. The follow-on leadership recognized that this kind of brutal treatment and starvation and so forth was not paying any dividends, and they were not getting anything from us, because what it did mainly was anger you and cause you to be a lot more resistant than maybe you would have been had the conditions been a lot better. So the fact was that our condition did change a lot. And our wives that hung in there basically made a number of trips to Europe, visited International Red Cross conventions and so on, and put the press on our government and their governments, particularly Soviet Union and the Allied Iron Curtain countries, to put the press on China and Vietnam to ease up on our treatment. And without any question, that had some impact. And subsequent to that, we got some additional clothes and another blanket, and which doesn't sound all that much here at 100 degrees, but back in those days, that was really great. Also, the food improved by at least 25–30%. Our basic food rations were probably about 600 to 700 calories a day. We were getting a bowl of rice and a green weed soup or a pumpkin soup, and it was guaranteed to take a third of your body weight off in about 3 to 4 months. So everything got better when Ho Chi Minh died. And I know that the devil welcomed that old son of a bitch, and I hope he's burning in hell today.
Okay, folks. Do we have any questions before we go back to have the book signed?
Would you care to talk about Jane Fonda, or shall we just pass by that?
Yeah, the question was, what about Jane Fonda? Well, Basically, she was a traitorous woman, a woman that had some acting talent, and she disgraced her father, who was a pretty good guy, a pretty good actor. And basically, she worked hand in glove with the Vietnamese to propagandize against us, propagandize against the country. You know, she had some pictures taken on a gun site with a Vietnamese crew pretending that she's shooting a gun up in the air. So, unfortunately, she was just a traitorous, bottom-feeding old woman who thought she was stealing the spotlight back at that time. And we never let her forget it.
Anyone else? I understand Tom Hayden was her husband at the time, isn't that correct?
Yeah, she was married to the guy who ran the Students for Democratic Society, Tom Hayden, which was one of the most notorious anti-war groups and worked harder against our country than anybody. But we got even with Tom Hayden also. Jerry Brown appointed him as a supervisor in Orange County, California, and Fonda was the best woman at this Miller's wedding, this Marine that I mentioned to you. So when Miller and Fonda ran Miller for re-election, the POWs circulated a bunch of petitions out through the county. He lost by 82% of the vote voted against him.
Someone else? His last chance. He's going to go over to the book signing. Okay, thank you, sir. Appreciate
Well, pleasure to be here. I'm glad you're here.
it. It's an honor to
Thank
know
you.
sir. I really appreciate it. I read your book, and